You may imagine the medieval locksmith as a figure of constant utility, endlessly busy securing treasures, safeguarding castles, and protecting merchants' wares. The reality, however, was far more mundane. In many small towns and villages across Europe between the 12th and 15th centuries, locksmiths were trained artisans who often found themselves crafting locks for a world that rarely used them. The idea of constant theft and danger was less pressing than we might believe today, and so the life of a locksmith often drifted into the quiet corners of boredom, interrupted only by the occasional request for a new key or the repair of a church door. The locksmith's day began at dawn. Like most tradesmen, his shop smelled faintly of iron and soot, for the work required the use of a small forge. Yet the forge was rarely in full use. Unlike a blacksmith who hammered horseshoes or weapons daily, the locksmith might spend long stretches without urgent commissions. Locks, when made well, were not replaced frequently. A single heavy iron lock could last decades, if not longer, and once installed on a merchant's chest or the door of a town granary, it could serve multiple generations without fault. Thus, the locksmith often turned to other minor metalworking tasks to keep himself occupied, mending hinges, patching chains, or even making decorative ironwork for windows. The locks themselves were not the sophisticated tumblers and keyholes of modern design. A medieval lock was often large, heavy, and crude by comparison. Some resembled a small iron box fixed to a door, while others were portable mechanisms attached to chests and coffers. Keys were oversized, made of iron, with long shafts and simple bits that pushed against levers or wards within the lock. To you, holding such a key today, it would feel cumbersome, almost theatrical. Yet in its own time, it represented security, though only in the most basic sense. It is worth pausing to consider the paradox here. Why invest in locks when so few doors were ever secured? The answer lies partly in symbolism. A lock was not just a barrier, it was a statement. For a merchant displaying a chest bound with iron and fitted with a large lock, the object declared his wealth and seriousness more than it physically deterred theft. A thief with determination could bypass many such locks, or even remove the chest entirely. Yet the presence of a lock communicated order, ownership, and legitimacy. In this way, locksmiths contributed to the theater of security more than its daily practice. Life for such a tradesman was steady, but never exciting. Apprenticeship in locksmithing could last years, requiring patience in the filing of metal, the precise shaping of wards within locks, and the forging of keys to match. The work demanded skill, but not constant innovation. Designs changed slowly, often handed down from master to apprentice with little alteration. A locksmith in 1250 might still be crafting locks much like those his grandfather had made. Yet each piece carried a certain individuality, for there was no standardized key or lock production. Every lock was unique, and every key bespoke. To replace a lost key meant returning to the locksmith who had made the lock in the first place, or finding another willing to painstakingly study and recreate the mechanism. And yet, how often did townsfolk actually lock their doors? Historical records suggest surprisingly rarely. In many small communities, trust and custom were the true barriers to theft. Villagers often left doors unlatched, not from negligence, but because the sense of shared responsibility discouraged intrusion. To steal from one's neighbor was to risk not only punishment but social exclusion, a far harsher fate in a world where survival depended on communal bonds. Thus, the locksmith's skill was needed most not for daily living, but for special circumstances when a noble family passed through with valuable baggage, when a monastery wished to safeguard relics, or when a town treasury required reinforcement. The daily rhythm of the locksmith reflected this scarcity of demand. After tending his forge in the morning, he might work slowly on filing iron into the necessary shapes. Filing was an essential, time-consuming practice, for creating the wards within a lock required precise grooves and slots. Each stroke of the file carried the sound of rasping patience, echoing in the workshop while dust motes drifted in the air. If no orders pressed upon him, he might turn to household repairs. In some cases, locksmiths were asked to produce tools, iron nails, small blades, or hinges for furniture. He was not strictly limited to locks, for survival as a craftsman meant versatility. It is also notable that many locksmiths inherited their trade as part of a family business. Sons of locksmiths often became locksmiths themselves, not out of passion, but from circumstance. A child raised among iron filings and soot naturally absorbed the skills, and with limited opportunities for other professions, the path seemed inevitable. The craft, then, became a lineage, not a calling. The pride of the trade was not in excitement, but in endurance, the ability to produce steady, reliable work in a quiet and uneventful way. Yet locksmiths had their place in the larger fabric of medieval society. Town charters sometimes listed them alongside other artisans. their rights and duties recorded in official documents. In certain cities, locksmiths formed small guilds, though their gatherings were modest compared to the more powerful guilds of weavers, masons, or merchants. Records from some towns in France and Germany suggest that locksmiths were occasionally called upon to serve civic roles, such as maintaining the locks of city gates or ensuring that prison cells could be secured. Here, their work bore more direct significance, for a faulty gate lock might compromise the safety of the entire town. Still, such tasks came sporadically, and the rest of the locksmith's time returned to the slow rhythm of craft. Imagine, then, a locksmith in a town like Chartres or York around the year 1350. His workshop sat on a narrow street, perhaps near other tradesmen. The walls were darkened with soot, the floor scattered with filings of iron. A half-finished lock sat on the bench, its iron case awaiting further filing. Beside it lay a collection of oversized keys, each with unique notches, none interchangeable. Customers came in frequently, perhaps a merchant once a week, perhaps a cleric seeking a new key for the church strongbox. In between, the locksmith occupied himself with maintenance, careful not to waste costly materials. He purchased iron in small amounts, for it was expensive, and every scrap had to be used. Even mistakes could not be discarded lightly. They might be reforged into nails or smaller tools, despite the dull pace. There was an artistry in the work. Some locksmiths decorated their locks with patterns, etching designs into the surface, or shaping keys into elegant forms. A noble patron might request a lock with elaborate wards, not for security, but for prestige. In such moments, the locksmith's work touched on the realm of beauty, where iron became not only functional, but ornamental. Still, these occasions were rare, and most days slipped by without flourish. The locksmith's role in society was paradoxical, essential in theory, peripheral in practice. Locks were symbols of order, but their makers lived quietly, their skills seldom celebrated. Yet this very quietness was part of the medieval world's rhythm. Security did not rest in iron alone, but in custom, reputation, and the web of obligations that bound people together. A lock was an object of reassurance more than necessity, and so the locksmith's life unfolded in the shadow of that reassurance, a craft defined by rarity, persistence, and an almost ceremonial importance. And so, you might ask yourself, in a world where few doors were ever locked, what purpose did the locksmith truly serve? Was he a guardian of security, or merely a craftsman of symbols, producing objects more for comfort than for need? If you were to follow the locksmith further into his world, beyond the quiet monotony of filing and forging, you would begin to notice how deeply his trade was tied to patterns of trust, authority, and ritual. A lock was never simply a device. It was often bound to social meaning, to the ways in which medieval people thought about ownership and community. And in this, the locksmith's role became less about physical protection and more about shaping how people understood boundaries. The medieval town itself was a place where boundaries mattered. Most towns were surrounded by walls, and the city gates were opened at sunrise and closed at sunset. These gates often had locks, large and cumbersome, and their keys were entrusted to specific officials, sometimes to the mayor, sometimes to a council of aldermen. To hold such a key was to hold authority, and the locksmith who had made or maintained the lock participated, however indirectly, in this ritual of civic order. The town was secured not merely by its walls, but by the ceremonial act of turning a key, a gesture that told everyone inside that the day had begun or ended. The locksmith, then, often lived in two worlds. In his workshop, he was a tradesman, his work practical and slow. But in the symbolic imagination of the town, he was the craftsman of trust itself, the one who made possible the gestures of authority. This symbolic weight was far greater than the daily demand for his products. His trade became one of occasional importance, deeply felt when needed, but otherwise fading into the background. To understand why locks were so rarely used in daily life, one must look at how people stored value. In an age before banks were widely available to ordinary people, wealth was often kept in forms that were not easily stolen. Land, for instance, could not be carried away. Livestock, too, though movable, required effort to steal and was usually kept in enclosures. Even coins, which did circulate, were not always abundant in households. A peasant family might own little in the way of cash, and their goods, pots, clothing, tools had more use value than exchange value. To break into such a house would yield little worth the risk. Merchants and nobles, of course, had more to lose, and it was among them that locksmiths found their most reliable customers. A merchant traveling with goods might secure them in a chest with iron bands and a heavy lock. The chest itself could be carried off, but the lock provided a degree of delay and difficulty enough, perhaps, to discourage casual pilfering. Similarly, monasteries and churches often commissioned locks for their strong boxes, where donations and relics were kept. Here again, the lock's purpose was not absolute security but ceremonial assurance. When a priest turned a key to open a reliquary, the sound of iron moving against iron carried a weight of meaning. Access was restricted, guarded, made legitimate. Locks also played a role in prisons, though not as commonly as one might think. Many medieval jails were little more than secure rooms with barred windows, and prisoners were often held not by locks but by chains or by the sheer walls of the building. Still, locksmiths were sometimes called upon to make shackles, manacles, or the locks that secured cell doors. In such cases, their craft took on a darker role, one tied not to reassurance but to coercion. The sound of a lock clanging shut on a prison door was a reminder of authority enforced, not shared. But most days did not involve such weighty commissions. The locksmith might spend his time making keys for locks that had already been installed. A key, after all, could be lost easily. Unlike modern keys, which can be duplicated from a blank in minutes, medieval keys were each bespoke, crafted to fit a single lock. To lose a key was to render the lock useless, unless one returned to the locksmith to have a new one made. This could involve careful study, testing the wards of the lock, and filing a new key shaft until it matched. It was tedious work, requiring patience more than ingenuity. And yet, for all the locksmith's patience, customers were not always patient themselves. Some complained at the time required or balked at the cost of iron, which was never cheap. Others might bring in locks damaged by misuse, demanding repairs. The locksmith, though not a figure of great wealth, did occupy a respectable middle tier of society. He was not as exalted as a master mason or goldsmith, but he ranked above unskilled laborers. His trade required tools, training, and space. A workshop with a forge was not something every man could afford. Locksmiths occasionally traveled to fairs or markets, carrying examples of their work to display. These locks, sometimes more decorative than practical, showed off the craftsman's skill. Some were fitted with intricate wards that required keys of unusual shape, demonstrating cleverness and mastery. A noble might order such a lock to display his status, for the complexity itself was a form of prestige. In such cases, the locksmith's boredom gave way to brief bursts of artistry, moments when his craft was admired not for its function, but for its form. It is interesting to note that in some records, locksmiths are mentioned alongside blacksmiths with little distinction. In smaller villages, the same man might serve as both, making horseshoes one day and locks the next. But in larger towns, specialization became more common, and the locksmith emerged as his own figure. Still, he was never far from the shadow of the blacksmith. If the blacksmith was the muscular heart of the town, hammering out tools and weapons, the locksmith was the quieter cousin, working on smaller, more delicate things. His forge was not the place of sparks flying and great clangs of iron, but of finer adjustments, the rasp of files, and the steady glow of embers. For all this quiet, however, the locksmith's trade carried with it an unspoken irony. He was, in a sense, the craftsman of mistrust. To commission a lock was to acknowledge that one could not rely entirely on trust, that some barrier was necessary between oneself and others. And yet, as we have seen, most people lived in a world where trust was still the primary bond. Did this make the locksmith an outsider of sorts, one who reminded others of suspicion in a world that prided itself on communal bonds? Or was he, rather, a quiet reassurance, a reminder that mistrust could be managed, contained, and given physical form in a lock and key? There were also stories, whispered but seldom recorded, of locksmiths misusing their skills. After all, who better than a locksmith to pick or bypass a lock? The possibility always lingered that a man who could make a lock could also undo it. In some towns, laws were passed restricting locksmiths from duplicating keys without the owner's consent. The guilds, where they existed, often enforced codes of conduct, ensuring that locksmiths maintained reputations of honesty. Yet the suspicion remained, and perhaps it added a certain mystique to their otherwise dull craft. The locksmith, who spent most days in obscurity, was also the one man who, if he chose, could bypass the very barriers he created from the outside. His life appeared quiet, repetitive, even uneventful. But beneath this monotony lay currents of meaning, locks that guarded symbols more than goods, keys that represented authority more than access, and a trade that balanced trust with mistrust in equal measure. The locksmith's hammer and file shaped not just iron, but the invisible lines between people, between what was shared and what was withheld. And so the question lingers, was the medieval locksmith a man of practicality, serving rare but necessary needs, or was he a quiet philosopher of his age, shaping the ways in which society thought about possession, secrecy, and safety? By the time a medieval locksmith reached the latter years of his career, His life had usually settled into a rhythm that looked much the same as it had decades earlier. The locks he produced were sturdy, sometimes ornate, often heavy, and almost always unique. His workshop smelled of metal filings, old soot, and iron dust. His tools wore down more quickly than his locks did. And while his role in society was never grand, it was steady. And steadiness was its own kind of reward in an age of plagues, wars, and famines. The irony of his life was that he, who specialized in creating barriers, often lived in a house that remained unlocked. Locksmiths themselves were not targets of crime, nor did they live surrounded by treasures. Their wealth was modest, their homes filled with the ordinary goods of a tradesman's tools, wooden furniture, and perhaps a chest for storing scraps of iron. There was little for thieves to covet. The locksmith's greatest treasure was his skill, a skill that could not be stolen by breaking a door, but only by years of apprenticeship and patience. Apprenticeship remained central to the locksmith's world. A young boy, sometimes a son, sometimes a neighbor's child, would spend years in the workshop. His first tasks were menial, sweeping the floor, stoking the fire, fetching water, and holding tools. Only after long observation would he be allowed to file metal or shape iron under supervision. The making of a key required an eye for precision and a steady hand. The making of a lock required not only precision, but the imagination to envision how the wards and levers would fit together unseen within a small iron case. For many apprentices, the trade was a slow climb toward mastery, one measured not in sudden breakthroughs, but in incremental improvements. The locks themselves sometimes outlasted the locksmiths who made them. Archaeological finds across Europe have uncovered medieval locks still intact, rusted but recognizable, centuries after their makers died. Each of these locks once represented hours of work, a chain of tiny choices: how thick to make the case, how wide to file the key's teeth, how many wards to place inside. No two were identical. And in this uniqueness lies a strange intimacy. Each lock was like a signature, a mark of the craftsman's hand preserved in iron. To turn a key in such a lock today is to retrace the gestures of a man long forgotten, whose name was not recorded in chronicles or songs, but whose work endured in silence. Guilds, where they existed, helped to preserve this continuity. In larger cities like Paris or Cologne, locksmiths banded together in modest associations. The guild provided standards of conduct, regulated apprenticeships, and sometimes lobbied for the rights of craftsmen. Yet locksmiths were never among the most powerful guilds. Their numbers were small, their influence limited. Unlike bakers or weavers, whose products were consumed daily, locksmiths produced objects of long duration, not daily necessity. As a result, their guilds often resembled little more than mutual aid societies, offering support in times of illness or death. Still, for a tradesman accustomed to solitude in his workshop, the guild provided a sense of belonging. The locksmith's trade also intersected, in curious ways, with the shifting fortunes of medieval law. As towns grew, so did the need for record keeping, for storing charters, seals, and contracts. Chests bound with iron bands and secured with locks became common in town halls and merchant guild halls. Here the locksmith's work gained a dignity it did not always possess elsewhere. To be trusted with securing the town's chartered chest was no small responsibility. The lock did not merely guard parchment. It guarded the very identity of the town, its rights and privileges granted by kings or emperors. A broken lock in such a context was not a minor inconvenience, but a crisis of legitimacy. Locks also played their part in the domestic lives of the wealthy. Nobles and prosperous merchants sometimes had doors fitted with locks, though again more for symbolism than practical defense. To lock one's bedchamber door was less about fear of theft than about asserting privacy, a concept that slowly gained prominence in late medieval life. The very act of turning a key, of closing a space against intrusion, suggested an emerging sense of the individual household as distinct from the larger communal world. Privacy, as much as security, was born in iron, yet it is important not to exaggerate. The locksmith's impact, while meaningful in certain symbolic contexts, remained modest in daily life. Most villagers never needed his services. Most houses had simple latches or wooden bars, not iron locks. Most people, if they wanted to protect something, relied on hiding it or entrusting it to the collective watchfulness of their neighbors. The locksmith, then, was a specialist of exceptions, a craftsman whose skills mattered most in unusual circumstances, when wealth, authority, or ritual demanded the weight of a lock and key. And still, there was boredom. Hours of filing, days of waiting for commissions, weeks without meaningful work. For some locksmiths, this boredom was alleviated by branching into other crafts. Some made small iron goods, others repaired tools. A few even turned to making weapons in times of conflict. Though this blurred the line between locksmith and blacksmith, others coped by embracing the slowness itself, finding comfort in repetition. in the rasp of the file and the glow of the forge. The locksmith's life was not dramatic, but it was stable. And in an age when famine or plague could upend existence overnight, stability was no small gift. There is also a philosophical dimension to consider. To make a lock is to acknowledge vulnerability. To accept a lock is to admit that trust alone is not enough. The locksmith lived at the intersection of these realities, providing reassurance in a material form. But he also lived with the knowledge that his work was never absolute. Every lock could be broken, every barrier overcome. Perhaps this gave him a certain humility, a quiet awareness that his craft was less about preventing theft than about shaping the perception of safety. When we look back now, centuries later, the locksmith's life may seem dull, almost invisible against the backdrop of kings, wars, and revolutions. Yet without his craft, how would those kings have guarded their treasuries? How would monasteries have safeguarded relics, or towns their charters? The locksmith's locks were never unbreakable, but they were good enough. And good enough was often all that history required. His work was the iron punctuation in the story of medieval life, marking moments of possession, of privacy, of authority. And so, the locksmith who rarely locked anything leaves us with a paradoxical legacy. His craft was born of mistrust, but practiced in a world where trust still mattered more. His objects were rarely used but deeply symbolic when they were. His days were long and quiet, but the products of his boredom, those heavy iron locks and awkward keys, still survive. Rusted yet recognizable, testaments to a life lived in quiet service. Perhaps the most fitting way to remember him is not as a man of action, but as a man of endurance, whose work reminds us that history is built not only by those who command armies or sign treaties, but also by those who file iron in dim workshops, producing objects that shape the boundaries of daily life in ways too small to notice, yet too significant to ignore. And so one must wonder, in a world that has since surrounded itself with locks on doors, safes, gates, and machines, would the medieval locksmith be surprised at how central his once peripheral craft has become? Or would he simply nod, having always known that even the simplest lock carries a meaning far beyond its iron shape?